Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So we had actually missed last week. I was a little under the weather. I apologize. But we will continue on today. And we begin the New Testament today. So as we look at the chart in front of us, it really is it's a breakout of really kind of as simply as possible the type of genre or the particular literature type that the New Testament has. So there's 27 books in the New Testament. Notice that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the book of Acts are under history because they are narratives. Though they have doctrinal teaching within them, they're classified as a history book because they're basically stating historical events, and we'll jump a little deeper into that when we move forward. But for now, we want to understand that those are books that are historical narratives, and when you have a teaching that is contained in a historical narrative, sometimes it's meant for any reader. Like, for example, as we read through the Gospels and the book of Acts, as Christians, we are taking what is said in a sense as though it would be written to us. However, we need to make sure that we don't apply what is specifically written for people that are under the law. Now, we learn in the book of Galatians, Paul teaches us that Christ was born under the law in Galatians 4. And so born of a virgin under the law. So Jesus was under the law. So Jesus actually kept the law. He didn't break the law. There was no violation of the law. Otherwise, he would have been a sinner. Just so that, as a side note, when the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, when they were contending with Jesus for breaking the Sabbath day or, eating with unwashed hands, either working on the Sabbath day or traveling on the Sabbath day or whatever they were doing, that they were always in contention with him or his disciples, it was because there are two views of what the law was. So the first view, obviously, is the Old Testament as we understand it. Moses gave them the law, and then that was written, and that's what they lived by. They also had something called oral traditions. And the oral traditions basically went beyond the law of Moses. So in a sense, if you have the law of Moses in the middle, you would be adding laws around it. So when they came out of their captivity, if you remember the previous videos, when we went through the 70-year captivity in Babylon, when they came back, because they were sent there for idolatry, when they returned, they wanted to make sure they would never be idolatrous again. So in a sense, what they did was they built a fence around the law. They made a wall, and that wall was the oral tradition. So if it said that you weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath day, and that was contained in Moses' law, what they would do is they would surround it with extra laws to make sure that it was more stringent so that you couldn't penetrate that outer barrier of the oral law to get to the actual law and break it. And so, like their view that Jesus was working on the Sabbath day, that he was accusing them of, was false. He wasn't working on the Sabbath day. He was not breaking Moses' law. He was breaking their perceived version of the oral law. And that's unfortunately where most of the contentions came in. It was surrounding their view of what they should be following as opposed to what Moses laid out. That's why Jesus said, John chapter 5 is a great example. So he heals the man at the pool of Bethesda. They accuse him of working on the Sabbath. He says, my father has worked until now and I worked. And then they said, we're going to stone you because you calling God your father, which grammatically is your very own father. And they understood exactly what you're saying. They said, you being a man are making yourself equal to God. That's exactly what he was saying. Now, they didn't recognize who he was, so for them, that was a blasphemy. But it started out with the contention that he was working on the Sabbath day. So Jesus' response to that was not, oh, you're misunderstanding, I wasn't trying to make myself equal with God. He actually went on to describe and put down exactly how he was equal with God. And so by the time you get to the end of John chapter 5, he said, if you had listened to Moses, you would have believed me. So, in other words, Jesus lived by and operated by the Mosaic law, never broke it. He was perfect in it. And so their view being beyond that to the oral tradition, they were not as interested in Moses' law as they were in the surrounding laws to try to prevent people to actually getting to it so that they wouldn't violate it. And in doing that, they were violating it, oddly enough. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels. We'll talk about that. John is different in its layout. Some things are similar, but it's written differently and for different reasons in a sense. And then you have the book of Acts, which is really the expansion of the church. You have this work at Pentecost, where the church begins in Acts chapter 2 and then expands out to Acts 28 and still going today. Next, as you can see next to history, we have letters. And there are Paul's letters. Now, Paul really wrote the majority of the New Testament. And you can see he had his early letters, Galatians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, the Corinthians, and Romans. And then the later, after the arrest at Jerusalem. Now notice his first imprisonment, when he was in prison at Jerusalem, he wrote what we call the prison epistles, which is Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon, and Philippians. And then he was released. He writes 1 Timothy and Titus, and then his last book is 2 Timothy. And it was after that that it's believed that Nero had beheaded him. Now, the general epistles, they are other authors. Obviously, James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, he got converted after the resurrection. He wrote James. It's a very Jewish-focused book on Jewish believers. Jude was also Jesus' half-brother. These guys were not apostles, but they were related to Christ as half-brothers. And then you have, obviously, Peter's epistles and John's. And then we have the book of Hebrews. Nobody really knows who authored Hebrews. I believe it was Paul personally. He's obviously among the selections. I just think that much of it is very Pauline, but it doesn't really matter. God knows who wrote it. It's obviously an inspired text. Tremendous book. One of my favorites. It was the first book I actually studied with a Bible commentary in-depthly as a young Christian, which is probably not the best book to pick because every time I would read it, there would be so much from the Old Testament that I had to go back. Now, in hindsight, I'm glad I did. At the time, it was a lot of work because I didn't know the Bible well. So as I was going through the book of Hebrews, every time it had an Old Testament quote, which is the majority of the book, I had to go back and then read and get the context of what was quoted so I would understand how it was being used. A lot of work, but, great results. And then finally, we have the only, prophetic book in the New Testament, which is the book of Revelation. It is obviously mostly futuristic. It does have some application to the churches in chapter 2 and 3, but after chapter 2 and 3, everything else is future, has not occurred yet. So we have history, we have letters, we have prophecy, and that's how it lays out. Now, another kind of view of the books, in a sense. This, for some, may be easier to look at. You have the historical, again, with the Gospels and Acts. Now, notice on the right, the Gospels are the manifestation of Christ. So they're telling the story of who he is and what he did. It's really that simple. That's why if you read Matthew, Mark, or Luke as an evangelical Christian, you're not going to get the message that, it's not like a Billy Graham crusade where they're going to tell you to be born again and everything. That's not going to happen, because they're writing down what he did and who he was as evidence that he is the Messiah. Okay. Now, obviously, they each have a different focus, which we will get into, but they all manifest Christ in one way or another. The book of Acts is really the Acts of the Holy Spirit, because he's the one that really is now doing the work. In Acts 1, it says, this is, Luke tells us that this, and again, Acts is Luke volume 2, if you will. He wrote the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts. We find out that he joined Paul's missionary journey in Acts 16:10. So prior to that, it's always they, and then it changes to we, because he joined the team. But it's really the Holy Spirit working through these men to proclaim the message of Christ. So you go from manifesting who he is in the Gospels, to propagation, which is now taking that message and bringing it out to the unsaved world. Epistolatory is obviously the epistles. They are letters to various churches or individual people. And then that is the explanation. So notice it says, developing the full significance of the person and work of Christ and how this should affect the walk of the Christian in the world. So the epistles are actually the specific instruction for the church. If you look at Moses' law for the Jew under the Old Covenant, the law told them how to live. It explained everything they needed to do, how to be right with God, how to stay right with God. You get right with God through the sacrifices. The law was not meant to save them. The law was to sanctify them as a nation of Israel. So the sacrifices brought them near and acceptable to God so they could have a relationship. The 7 feasts, these are in Leviticus 23. The 7 feasts reminded them of the significance of events so that they could continue to understand their history, their ideology, who they were as a people, and then it was a constant reminder so that they could walk with God, abide in him. So in a sense, the sacrifices was the approach, and then the feasts were the abiding. And then finally, we have the prophetical, which is Revelation, as we mentioned, and that is the consummation of everything. So anticipating end times, the return of the Lord, his reign, and in the eternal state. So, another mention on the epistles. The epistles will take what the Gospels and the book of Acts have in history and put it down for instruction. So there is no disharmony between what we see in the book of Acts and then the letters. They all work together. But it's important to understand that because the church gets its instruction not from the law of Moses, it gets it from the epistles. The epistles are the fulfillment of what Jesus talked about in the Gospel of John when he said that the Holy Spirit would bring you into all truth, right? And so that's really a development of what that is. So the manifestation, the propagation, the explanation, and then the consummation. Now, this gives you a little more refined date for the New Testament books. And notice James and Galatians are really the earliest, with Thessalonians. And we actually, we don't really see the first gospel until like probably almost, about 20 years after Christ, after the crucifixion and resurrection. So, there are certain ways that the books are dated based on manuscript evidence, early church father quotes, and things like that. And notice after 70 AD. So pretty much the majority of the New Testament was written by 70 AD. That's when Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus Vespasian, Roman general. So he ends up basically killing millions of people and destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD. And that's really what scattered the Jews. And then there was a second one in, it was either 150 or 130 AD, which finally got them all out of the area. But that's never mentioned in the New Testament other than Jesus anticipating it in the Gospel of Luke, talking about the enemies surrounding Jerusalem. Now, John wrote the book of Revelation, between 90 and 95, and his other writings, obviously, after 70 AD. And, Jude can be anywhere in there. But the reason it's important with John's writing, especially the book of Revelation, is because there are people that teach what's called preterism or partial preterism. So preterism, full preterism technically is a heresy because really what you're saying is everything has been fulfilled, Jesus is not returning again, and that's heretical. Partial preterism, which a lot of guys like R.C. Sproul and Hank Hanegraaff and some of the other these guys in the Reformed Church, some of them are preterists or partial preterists because what they are doing is they are saying the book of Revelation has already been fulfilled. They leave room for Jesus' second coming, but other than that, they say everything was fulfilled in 70 AD. There's really no way to have 70 AD fulfill the book of Revelation without allegorizing the entire thing, which is what they do. But I know, I believe of recent, I think it might have been Gary DeMar, who has actually gone to full preterism. I think I heard that. If that's the case, that he's a heretic at this point, no different than a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or anybody else. But that's a dangerous doctrine because you're essentially saying that everything has been fulfilled by 70 AD, nothing left. Well, where's the second coming of Christ? Well, it's just kind of, metaphorical or whatever. And it's like, well, that dog doesn't hunt. I don't have to be from down south to know that one. So anyways, that's why it's important that the book of Revelation is understood to be written later, and the evidence is all there for that. So the New Testament, 27 books in total. They are historical books like we saw. Paul, his epistles. I put Hebrews in there just though it may not technically be there. And then the non-Pauline epistles and Revelation for the final. So a note on the Gospels, synoptic, right? We call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic Gospels. Why is that? Though each Gospel has its distinct emphasis and purpose, the first three are sometimes referred to as the synoptic Gospels because they see together. That's what synoptic means. That is, they have the same point of view with regard to the life of Christ, agreeing in subject matter and order. So synoptic, you go to, I have to go to the optician to get glasses, right? So that's the optic, so I can see. And so the synoptic, the synonym or whatever, it's the same view, right? That's what the word means. So halfway through, the sentence says, they also present the life of Christ in a way that complements the picture given in the Gospel of John. The following list provides a number of areas that are common to each of the first three Gospels. So we see this in all the Gospels. This is what makes them synoptic. It's the same point of view from different perspectives. So they're looking at the same events, but you'll get a little bit of a different, they have a different vantage point, each of them. So they all talk about the announcement by John the Baptist, the Messiah is coming, the baptism of Jesus with John, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days, teaching and miracles of Jesus, right, which is a major portion of each gospel, the transfiguration. Now, this is where Jesus was transfigured up on the mountain with, Peter, James, and John. So they were there, and that was evidence of the coming kingdom, that he's the king. He was transfigured before them into his glorified body, which he would have in the kingdom. And it says he talked with Moses and Elijah. The cloud come overhead, the voice come out from the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him," or hear him. He obviously has the final and complete revelation over the law, represented by Moses, and the prophets, represented by Elijah. Peter makes mention of this in his second epistle, in comparison to Scripture. So he says, we were with him on the mountain. We heard the voice, right? We saw the whole event, but there's a more sure word of prophecy. In other words, I can tell you what I saw and heard. I can be a great eyewitness, but let me tell you something that's even more sure than that, and that is prophecy, because prophecy is written with the anticipation of fulfillment, and Jesus fulfilled the prophecies regarding the Messiah. And that's really what's brought out in the Gospels, especially Matthew lays it out very systematically because he's writing to Jews to help them understand how Jesus had fulfilled the requirements for being the Messiah. The trial, death, and burial of Jesus, obviously, and then the resurrection. So each of them have, one of the, each of these in the synoptic gospels. Now, so let's look at the purpose and distinctive focus of the four gospels where we're talking about them right now. So first, there are four living creatures or cherubim described in both Ezekiel chapter 1 and in Revelation 4:7, when John goes into heaven. They both see basically the same four creatures surrounding the throne. So Ezekiel says this, "As for the likeness of their faces, They four had the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face on the right side, and they four had the face of an ox on the left side, and they four also had the face of an eagle. Definitely strange looking creatures. However, we want to pull this out. The lion symbolizes supreme strength, kingship. The man, the highest intelligence, right, of all God's creation. The ox, service. And the eagle, heavenliness, because it flies so high, or divinity. That's kind of what they represent. Now, as we look, in Matthew, we see the Messiah king. He's the lion. He's the lion of the tribe of Judah. So this is how Matthew actually presents him. And if we look at Matthew, only Matthew and Luke provide a genealogy. Matthew's genealogy goes back to Abraham. If you could not establish that the Messiah came through Abraham's line, then the Jews were not interested. So, coming through Abraham, he works the genealogy back through the tribe of Judah to David, all the way back to Abraham. So that tells us that Jesus is genealogically able to be the Messiah. In Mark, we see that he is God's servant, the ox. So the ox was the animal that did all the hard work. I don't know if you've ever seen an ox in person. A few years back, my wife and I went to a fair, actually, up in Maine, and it was the Freiburg Fair. I believe they have it every year. And some of what they have is, it's really designed for a lot of farmers and all that. But it was really interesting because they had these competitions and these things where they showed different animals. And they would show these ox. They would team up these ox, and then they would present them, to get a blue ribbon or whatever. And I went up next to some of these things are enormous. They were taller than I was. They're huge, So it's interesting, you're not supposed to, under the law, you're not supposed to yoke, the yoke that sits over the necks of animals for them to work. You don't yoke an ox and a donkey. Well, obviously, not only the donkey is smaller, it would kill the donkey because it doesn't have the same, stepping gait as the donkey. The ox is able to pull more and push harder and do all that work. And the donkey would never survive it. And obviously, it's a metaphor, later on for, not being unequally yoked. Paul uses that in 2 Corinthians 6 about, believers and unbelievers, and whether it's in marriage, or I think it would be applicable in business and other things, because Christians going to have a whole different view, a whole different worldview, perspective, outlook, plan, future that an unsaved person just doesn't have, So it creates a lot of room for clash. We see Luke, Dr. Luke, he puts Jesus under the microscope and shows that he is the perfect man. He dials him right in on every nook and cranny. And so Jesus is God's ideal man. If you want to know what God intended for man to be when he created Adam, you see it in Jesus Christ. And yes, that's perfection. But at the same time, that's God's intention. That's why we are being conformed into the image of Christ, because the image of Adam has been marred. So Jesus, as the Son of Man, is really presented as the perfect human being. Now, what's interesting is Mark really writes to the Roman. The Romans were workers, okay? And their culture and everything else just, there was 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. So there was an identification with the Roman world through Jesus as a servant. In Luke, because it was a Greek-speaking world, Alexander the Great had conquered the known world, which, had everybody speaking Greek, but it also brought a lot of the Greek culture into that world. And then, Rome took over, but, it had already been impacted by Greece. And so the Greeks are always looking for the ideal man. You see that in their pantheon of gods and everything. They all have some measure of perfection, except for one, some weakness that they all have. And because the Greeks were on a hunt for the ideal man. Well, you can find that in Christ. John is written really more towards certainly unbelievers, but more towards believers. We always recommend that new believers, read the Gospel of John just because of the significance of what's written. However, the Gospel of John really focuses on the deity of Christ. Where Luke shows him as the Son of Man, John shows him as the Son of God. And that's important because, when I take my high school class through the Gospel of John, I have them do different exercises. I have them outline the book. In other words, they need to read each chapter and reduce the theme of each chapter down to the shortest number of words that they can put on the page. Okay. For example, John chapter 1, you can kind of pull verse 14. The Word became flesh. That's as simple as you can make it, because you're showing that Jesus, from verse 1, the Logos, Logos, that's the word in Greek for word, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So God took on humanity through the Son. Now, that's chapter 1. Now, if you can read through the chapter a whole bunch of times and then reduce the whole thought down to that one item, that will not only give you the theme of the chapter in a sense, but it'll help remind you of what's in the chapter. And they have to do that with all 21 chapters. They also have to go through each chapter and pick out a verse or a saying or something that demonstrates that Jesus is God. Now, obviously, in some of the chapters, it's very, very easy. Jesus states it himself, right? That's a pretty good example. But, look, in chapter 1, you're loaded with verses. Verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, right? You go a couple of verses, he's a creator, and without him was not anything made that was made. Well, these are absolute statements, right? So, John 1:18, nobody has seen God at any time, but the only begotten Son who's in the bosom of the Father, he's declared him. Well, how can, if no man has seen God at any time, how's he seeing him, right? So, you have these statements, but anyways, the Gospel of John is important. Now, the Gospel of John is the only one that gives some measure of appeal to be a Christian. In chapter 20, John says, I write these things that you may believe that, essentially that Jesus is the Son of God, and that believing you'll have life through his name. That's about as close to an evangelical appeal as you're going to get out of all four Gospels, right? So just interesting. John's just set up a little different. It really, from chapter 13 on, you're talking about, the last night of his life on earth, right? Because that starts the Last Supper. Prior to that, you have Jesus in Jerusalem, in Judea, and then back to Jerusalem. And then it's really the final week of his life for the most part. So all four aspects are needed to give the full truth. As sovereign, he comes to reign and rule, right, as the king. As a servant, he comes to serve and suffer. As the Son of Man, he comes to share and sympathize. And then as Son of God, he comes to reveal and redeem. So I think, this is pretty good for, where we're at for today. And next time, what we'll do is we'll show the development of the gospel as it moves out in the book of Acts. So we've kind of made our way through the gospels at this point. So hopefully that's helpful. I know this is a very high view, but this is meant to be Bible basics, not in-depth theology class, okay? So we're at a little over half an hour. That should be good to digest for today. So until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.